If you've been coming to the church here regularly, you will know that in Sunday mornings we have been focusing on a series, and the series is A Wild Messiah for a Missional Church, or going back to the founder's plan for the church. And that is us essentially looking at the who and the what of Jesus in order to shape our own life as a congregation together. You may not know this, but way back at the beginning, I think I mentioned that every now and again we would break that series. And my plan was just to break the series. It gives us a little break anyway, but to break the series and then to do something from the Old Testament. And my suggestion was, well, we're going to do the book of Judges. However, after intense consultation during this week, and the first of these sermons nearly ready, I decided with others that this wasn't a wise approach. Mainly because the book of Judges is a very complicated book, and we think it's well worth doing, because it will take us into a world of darkness and violence and redemption, but it's complicated, and we need to engage with that world, but it doesn't make sense to try and do it. Let's do a wee sermon here. Here's Judge 1, and then Judge Dread 4 weeks later. Most of them are Judge Dread, to be honest, and then a few weeks later. So what we're going to do is we're really going to build that into a series for the autumn, and we will do the book of Judges as a series in the autumn. Whether we then tuck in the book of Ruth at the end, which makes the whole world brighter in the time of the Judges, I don't know, but it will lead us up to Advent. So that is what happened with that. We will continue to have breaks in between the series of the Wild Messiah for a Missional Church, and they will more be occasional sermons. That meant I had to find a new one for today very late on in the week, and this is where I landed, and I hope at some point in the sermon you'll see why I maybe landed on this for today. So it's going to still be in the New Testament, different gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 25 is where I'm going to read from today. Matthew chapter 25. And I'm going to read from verse 1. Matthew 25 has got a series of parables told by Jesus about what we call the return of Jesus Christ, when God comes again in the person of Jesus Christ to the world to finally and fully establish his kingdom. We have a series of parables in Matthew 25 about that. And we're reading one of these. Matthew 25, reading from verse 1. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but didn't take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come and meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." I want to ask you a little question about this parable, but not yet. This is a parable about waiting. I hope you saw what I did there. It's a parable about waiting, and perhaps like me, you may have had the type of experience I had once at an airport. The airport was busy. There were a lot of people milling about on the concourse, and there was a long queue at the checkout desk that I was wanting to use. And so I joined the end of the queue where there were 5 or 6 people standing there talking to one another. As I stood there waiting in anticipation to get nearer the desk in order to check in, I realized they weren't really paying attention to what was going on. And so after a moment or two, I said to them, "Excuse me, are you waiting or are you just standing here?" And that is a fair question, because they're not the same thing. Waiting is to do something with a sense of expectation, with anticipation. Waiting is something that we do that is intentional. We wait for something that is going to happen. And as it was, they were in fact just standing there. This is a parable about waiting. 10 women, 10 bridesmaids, 10 women waiting in a world where often women had to wait for men. 10 bridesmaids waiting for the arrival of the bridegroom. It's a parable about waiting. I have a question for you about this parable, but not yet. This is a parable about waiting. 10 bridesmaids waiting for the bridegroom, and people are waiting, but it's also a parable about being prepared in the waiting. They're waiting for the bridegroom. As a bagpiper who's played at a whole pile of weddings in Scotland, you spend an awful lot of time waiting. In fact, in one pipe band in which I played, we had a little phrase, and the phrase was, "Hurry up and wait." Because we were often rushed to a point where we were going to play, and then we waited for whatever it was we were going to play at. But at weddings, you need to be strategic. It's very important. For as a bagpiper, you're often expected to play for the guests, and then to wait, normally, for the bride. And that can take some time. So what do you do in the waiting? For the guests maybe arrive, and they go inside, and you're then waiting for whoever is still to come. Now, it becomes a little bit complicated, because if you just stop playing altogether, it means that by the time you come to play, your bagpipes have decided they didn't sound the way they did 10 minutes earlier because of the change in temperature and the lack of moisture going through the bag. So you have to play some of the time. But if you play too much and the bride takes too long, you might run out of puff. I was going to say you might run out of tunes, but that might not matter, because if you're someone like John Bertram, you think all bagpipe tunes sound the same, which is terrible, and therefore that wouldn't really matter. However, if you want to be ready to pray for the bride when she arrives, well, then you need to be strategic and you need to be prepared. In the waiting, we need to prepare. And a long time ago, I learned from some outdoor instructors this little bit of advice. They used to say, prior planning and preparation prevents a poor performance. That actually wasn't what they said. There's a much ruder version of it. But that was the version that I will repeat to you. In the waiting, we sometimes quite simply need to be prepared for what is going to happen. Our parable is about waiting, but it's also about being prepared in the waiting. For it was only 5 of the bridesmaids who were prepared, who had the oil, that when the bridegroom come, could welcome him and enter into the celebration. These 5, Jesus said, were wise. The others, he said, were foolish. All of them fell asleep, but 5 of them were prepared. Jesus calls the prepared ones wise. It's wise to be prepared. We're meant to be prepared in the waiting. I have a question I want to ask about this parable, but you know, not quite yet. This is a great parable. Jesus told this parable to his disciples, and then Matthew tells it to us. Therefore, it's a parable for us in the church. It's been passed on to us to hear and to listen to. We in the church will sometimes say in some of our words, Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. We are in the period of the waiting. And in the waiting, this parable is told for us to be prepared. And in the church, not that long ago, but before this time, people used to have a little chorus about this parable. I've got a whole pile of old choruses in a jukebox in my head. And when I press the button, they come out. And some of you will remember this. It's number 46 in the jukebox in my head. Give me oil in my lamp. Keep me burning. Give me oil in my lamp, I pray. Give me oil in my lamp, keep me burning, burning, burning. Keep me burning till the break of day. We should have sung that this morning, shouldn't we? If we should have put it in there. Now, finally, to get to the question about this parable, what is the oil? What does it represent? What is it that actually we're meant to do in the waiting? Before you answer it, think in this. It would appear that the oil is not something that we can easily transfer one to the other. Did you notice that? In the parable, the 5 who are described as wise had oil. But when the others came to ask for it, they wouldn't give it to them. I always thought that was pretty mean. But when you read the passage, it appears that it wasn't possible for them to share the oil, or then none of them would be prepared. Verse 8, the foolish ones said to the wise, give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out. Verse 9, no, they replied, there may not be enough for both us and you. Whatever the oil is, it doesn't seem easily to be something that we can transfer. And also, at least as the parable goes, it doesn't seem to be something you can get quickly or easily, because they rush off to get it, but they don't get back in time, and the door is shut. What is the oil? Give me oil in my lamp. What is meant to be in the lamp? The parable doesn't tell us. I think that's intentional, because parables are slippery things. Parables are not just neat illustrations that make everything clear. Parables are often a little bit ambiguous to make people think. They're clever. Rabbis, Jewish preachers, used to use parables, and Jesus used parables because he was clever. And because he knew somewhere in the future people were going to have to work out in their own context. What is the oil? What does it mean for us to be prepared in our context? The parable doesn't tell us. However, if you look at where this parable comes in Matthew, I think there is something we can say about the waiting. And if you were to read further in Matthew 25, you would see this. Because a little bit later in Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable where he makes it very clear that those who are welcomed in are those who would welcome him in the poor, in the marginalized, in the prisoner, and in the lost. Later in this chapter, in verse 31, Jesus says he will welcome into his kingdom those who have welcomed him. In the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the sick, and the prisoner, or as Jesus puts it, he will welcome those who have welcomed him in the least. Whatever the oil in our lamps should be, I think in the waiting we should be preparing by caring, not least, for the least. What is the oil? Let me tell you a story. In 1930, a 25-year-old Tommy Douglas, I think only 2 weeks married, 1930, Tommy Douglas became the pastor of a relatively small Baptist church called Calvary Baptist Church in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, Canada. 74 years later, he was voted in a television poll the greatest Canadian. Fun fact about Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas would become Kiefer Sutherland, the actor's grandfather, Kiefer Sutherland, who appeared in such films as Flatliners. I don't know if anyone ever remembers that. Few Good Men, 24, and Designated Survivor. However, much more interesting for me, at least, about the greatest Canadian was he was a Scot. Tommy Douglas was born in Falkirk. His dad was a steel worker. In 1910, I think the father went. 1911, the family immigrated to Canada. Less than, or about 3 years later, they were back in Glasgow, at least the mother and the children were, during the period of the First World War. And the family would stay in Glasgow, down there where the old co-op building is. The family would stay there, and the grandfather actually worked for the co-op. And Douglas, in his late childhood and early teens, lived in Glasgow, and he learned there to look after horses, which apparently became very helpful later for impressing his future father-in-law. At the end of the First World War, the family moved back to Canada. They moved back to Winnipeg. There, Tommy Douglas, I'm not sure when he was baptized, whether it was in Scotland or back in Canada, but there, Tommy Douglas continued his interest in the church. He was very small, but he was very wiry. He took up boxing, and in fact, he won the amateur Manitoba Boxing Championship. He also took up amateur dramatics. And when he was studying to be a minister, one of the ways in which he would make money was by doing recitals and monologues, often quoting the poetry of Robert Burns. Now, I hope you've seen what I did there. 25th of January, Burns Day. Okay. Sometimes you wonder. And Douglas loved the poetry of Robert Burns. He was undoubtedly aware of Burns's poem, The Dark Lament, Man is Made to Mourn. That is the poem with the very famous verse that says, many and sharp, the numerous ills interwoven in our frame, more pointed still, we make ourselves regret, remorse, and shame. And man, whose heaven-erected face the smile of love adorn, man's inhumanity to man make countless thousands mourn. And this poetry, along with his faith, had a huge impact on Douglas's life. Personally, pastorally, and later politically, he acted to bring humanity to people instead of inhumanity. As pastor at Weyburn Baptist Church, he arrived there at a time of economic depression. And as well as preaching a whole variety of sermons, doing Bible studies, doing drama with the young people, he also set up what we would consider would be an early form of a food bank, and he also set up a clothing bank. He caused some consternation in the town for supporting a miners' strike. He went to visit the miners, he saw the conditions in which they were living, and he went back and he told his own congregation about how terrible it was, which led to a complaint to the church from the mining authority. However, one of his congregation much later remembered Mr. Douglas was never political in church, but he was always for the underdog. That was clear whenever he spoke. Douglas complained and lamented the fact that people could not afford health care. He would recall, I buried a young man in Griffin and another at Pangman, both young men in their 30s with young families who died because there was no doctor readily available and they hadn't the money to get proper care. What do you say to their wives? Healthcare was a cause dear to his heart because he nearly lost his own leg. It was only saved when a surgeon took pity on him and operated on him if he could use him as a case study for the students. Douglas's concern as a pastor, and while a pastor, meant he stood for politics. And at his second attempt, he was elected as an MP. And then for the rest of his life, he remained an ordained Baptist minister. He continued to preach, but he was a politician. During his time as a politician, he constantly acted on behalf of the poor, of the underdog, of those who had nothing. He brought in policies as the Premier of Saskatchewan, which is kind of like First Minister of Scotland, slightly different, but the Premier of Saskatchewan. He brought in policies that not only improved the economy of the province, but over 3 terms, he worked to improve for pensioners, for the sick, for prisoners, for all the sort of people that Jesus somehow thinks that we should be caring towards. Finally, after 3 terms in office, he introduced into Saskatchewan, the first ever free universal health care system in Canada. And that became the inspiration for Canada to have its own universal health care system. And Tommy Douglas, Scott, Burns-loving Baptist minister, is considered the father of Medicare, Canada's free universal health care system. And I was fascinated to look at the Wikipedia article that does what a lot of writers do, and they talk about his move from the pulpit into politics. That made no sense to Douglas. All of his actions were the actions of one life and one faith being lived out in practice. In 1971, to a church group, he had a talk entitled "The Role of the Church in Modern Society." I quote from the typewritten version of it. He said, "The role of the church is not to supplant secular bodies, but to supply moral dynamic for change. Not to draw blueprints for economic systems, but to challenge people to remedy man's inhumanity to man, to set goals and challenges for people to meet them. You are the salt of the earth," he said to the church. "We are the preservatives of society." Of course, Douglas wasn't perfect. In recent years, he's been criticized because of some views that he wrote in his master's dissertation, I think when he was probably about 26 or 27 years of age, where he suggested some forms of social control through birth control. These were ideas that were quite common at the time. That doesn't make it right. Much more interesting is that latterly and very quickly he rejected these views and actively opposed them. Why do I tell you this story? That is his oil. And it simply asks us the question again that the parable is asking. What is our oil? How and in what ways are we filling our lamps as we wait and prepare for the return of Jesus? I have a question for you about this parable, and now I can give it to you again, and it's quite simple. What's the oil? As we conclude, we'll be led in some sung worship.